Good day again, my dear colleagues. We are starting our workshops. As we mentioned before, these workshops will be overseen by Francesca Racciopi and Nick Cavell. I wanted to thank Francesca for sharing her time with us to participate in our workshops, and thank you very much indeed for your yesterday's greetings, for you being all positive. Your positive vibes were transferred, went all around. Our viewers caught up on it. You did wonderful job yesterday with Pierre, and we're hoping that you will familiarize our colleagues from faraway regions with the HEAT software. You'll tell us how does it function and what results we may expect from it, how they can be applied in order to continue working.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Actually, good afternoon, everybody. And thanks for joining us today. You met me yesterday at the introduction of the course, and it is now a pleasure to be with you once again and to take you through the first part of the masterclass related to the health economic assessment tool. I am today together with my colleague, Dr. Nick Cavell, who has been one of the main trainers and main experts who have been working with the WHO for the last nearly 20 years to develop this tool. This is not something that we pulled out overnight. It is an ongoing effort that we have pulled together thanks to the effort of many experts all around the world. And you will be exposed to the latest development in this exciting field that is taking us now from the European context globally. But before we go into that, we will start this presentation with the more of a general introduction, because we are aware that you are coming from many different aspects, from many different disciplines, from different government departments, and from different disciplines and areas of expertise. Because of that, we think that it may be useful to bring everybody on the same page and have an understanding why, from a health perspective, we are so keen of promoting cycling and walking. Why is it so important? And why are we so excited to see that so much is finally happening now all around the world, partly also because of the recent experiences that we have had during the lockdowns. So what I will be doing now, I will start sharing my screen, and I will take you through a short journey, so to say, through the rationale, why we are here, why it is so important, why active mobility is so powerful. I hope you will enjoy the ride. So, I am sharing my screen, and I hope that I'm able to advance my slides. Yes. So why are we promoting active mobility? We have been thinking a lot about this. And the reason is there are three important reasons for this. The first one is what everybody knows already: promoting health and reducing non-communicable diseases. Active mobility is formidable. If you were to invent a new drug, a new effective drug, nothing would be stronger than active mobility to make people healthier simultaneously on all fronts. And I will spend a couple of words on that. But then we have also new evidence that tells us that improving and providing active mobility is a good way for increasing urban resilience to the challenge posed by the pandemics. For millions of people around the world, active mobility has been a lifeline, has been what has kept them connected to their communities, what has helped them to meet their daily needs, and also to survive and to go about stress and depression, because it was impossible for several people all around the world to have access to normal transport and mobility within cities. Active mobility has played a major role here. The third reason why we wanted to promote, and we believe it is important to promote active mobility, is because active mobility helps us protecting the planet by reducing carbon emissions. And even if you may think, oh, well, okay, this is rather intuitive, because of course you have less emissions coming from a tailpipe. Well, the good news is that we have published this year new evidence which quantifies that. And I'm sure you will be very excited to hear about this. So the first bit, the physical activity or inactivity and health. It is so important for us now to know that physical inactivity is, from a quantitative point of view, a risk factor comparable to smoking. And this is hugely important because as a child, I kept hearing my pediatrician and then as an adult, my doctor saying, yeah, walking is good for your health. Please try to walk more. But it was all intuitive. It was all based on good common sense. But what they were, the pediatrician, what my doctor was telling me was, be mindful. This is such an important opportunity for your health to be good. And it is so big because we do know how many millions of lives are lost to lung cancer because of smoking and because of the big risk factors to health. Well, now we know physical inactivity stands in the same order of magnitude. So this is why it is so important to be physically active. And I can share with you a couple of figures, a couple of numbers also from Europe. In Europe, we have nearly 1 million of lives that are lost every year because people are not sufficiently active from, from a physical point of view. And we believe that worldwide we have evidence that up to 5 million deaths could be averted if at the global level we were collectively more active. And we also know that the people who are insufficiently active have between 20 to 30% increased the risk of death compared to those who are active, sufficiently active. And it is very important to understand that when we say sufficiently active, we don't have in mind the performance of, an elite athlete. No, we have just in mind something like as little as 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity physical activity. Although, of course, the more you are active, the better it is. There is not a lower threshold. You will never be too little active. But there is, the more we walk, the more we cycle, the healthier we will be. So there is not an upper limit. And this is some of the important evidence that has been brought together when last year the updated version of the WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior have been launched. So what is the place of active mobility within that? Well, active mobility is a part of our daily life. We get up in the morning, normally we would walk, perhaps to get the train, to get the metro, a bus. Those are the luckiest one will just walk 20 minutes, half an hour to be in the school, to be at the work. Then we would walk again to go to the bakery. Perhaps we can walk to the restaurant nearby home. Or perhaps in the evening, we can walk or cycle to the park nearby. So physical activity through active mobility can be part of our daily life, can be part of us, can be a natural way for our body to meet its important needs. We have been built through the selection process that took us from the primordial growth to being the human species to move and to be active, as it has been said. And this is also one of the reasons why we are a machinery as a human beings. The human body is a very effective machine at storing and using energy. And this explains why we are so good at putting up weight, and while it is so difficult to lose weight when we store this energy in our fat tissues. So active mobility and health, we have already said it is important, but what about active mobility as such? Because people may say, oh, well, of course, if you go to the gym, if you are jogging, if you are rowing, if you are swimming, if you are playing all these, high intensity forms of physical activity, of course, this will be good for you. But, walking is or cycling, it is so, is this really effective? Well, this is the other big point that it is important for all of you to understand through this class, because it is the basis on which the HIIT tool works. This is the basic scientific knowledge behind the working of the HIIT tool. We have been looking at the evidence. We have brought the evidence together through systematic review and meta-analysis of the studies that have been conducted. And what we have found is that as little as physical, active mobility, cycling or walking, as what is needed to achieve the minimal WHO recommendations. So the 150 minutes per week that we recommend for adults throughout a week, which, roughly the 30 minutes per day or over 5 days, this little level of physical activity delivers approximately 10% of risk reduction for total mortality. This is simply huge. And this is the basis why, even when we are considering and factoring in the risks which come together with being physically active through active mobility, well, the benefits greatly outweigh the risks. And what you see here on this slide is a summary from one of the first historical studies that were done, looking at cycling and walking in different contexts, from different studies, taking together the health benefits that were coming because the people were more physically active, and looking at the health disbenefits which come from exposure to air pollution, for example, and exposure to injuries. And what we found was that on average, the median benefit to risk ratio is 9:1. Again, this is so big because of the slide that I showed you before, because the effect of active mobility on health is so powerful. And this is something that we have also seen when modeling the health effects of active mobility against extremely high level, very high levels of air pollution. What we have seen there is that you would really, really need to be cycling in an extremely polluted environment, above 95 micrograms per cubic meters of particulate matters to reach the tipping point for half an hour of daily cycling. It means the tipping point is the point when you don't accumulate, you don't gain more from your physical activity. And the break-even point, which is the point above which you start to have more risks than benefits, is for levels as high as 160 micrograms per cubic meter. Whenever we present this evidence, we always must be aware that there is a risk. There is a risk of somebody say, oh, you are downplaying this, or are you saying that it is good for people to cycle in polluted cities? Not at all. What we are saying to policymakers is if you really want to get most of the benefit of physical activity and active mobility out for your city, do address air pollution, because this is very important for the health of people, and do address road safety issues, because this is the most important deterrent for people to engage into active mobility. When we ask people, why are you not cycling? Why are you not walking? You will hear the answer very often is, I'm afraid the conditions are not safe enough. So, what about active mobility and urban resilience? And these are recent lessons that we have learned through the COVID experience. During the COVID experience, we have learned that walking, cycling have been providing a lot of benefits. First of all, during a time when physical distancing was paramount, active mobility has been a good way of maintaining this physical distance between people. It has also been a way for people to remain physically active when it has been impossible, while it was impossible to go to a gym or to practice organized sports activities as before. It remains feasible because we do know that people were meeting, when it was impossible to drive bicycles, or there were restrictions to the use of public transportation. It was still possible for people to go shopping or to meet their immediate needs within a distance that could be reached walking or cycling. And it was helping us as a society to reduce the need for using private motorized transportation that would have been a big disaster during the lockdowns if everybody had been simply switching from public transport to private motorized transport. It would have just been a huge disaster from an environmental and congestion point of view. So what we have been learning, and here you see some publications that are also available in Russian, is that the walking and cycling have been, a lifeline, tremendously important throughout the lockdown, but also their important extends beyond that. So in a way, from a policy perspective, we have had a window of opportunity to test in many different cities all around the world what an active mobility policy can be. Nick is with us today. He can share with us the big program of public spending that was started in the United Kingdom because, to subsidize the so-called pop-up cycle lanes. Perhaps some of these were not built in the right way, but there has been a huge movement to do that. And the reason was because at the time when people had to meet their mobility needs, we didn't want them to end up increasing the burden on health systems in case of accidents. So it was very important for this to happen safely. And this is why a lot of new infrastructure has been developed during the pandemic to support this shift in movement. But the other thing that we have learned, and I'm addressing particularly those of us who are working in transport planning and who have just seen how difficult it has been for public transportation over these months. Because, of course, public transportation need was heavily affected because of the requirements to provide physical distancing, so reduce the occupancy and many other challenges came there. But, active mobility has been part of the strategies to have a better redistribution of modal shares and therefore keeping public transport alive because we were supporting them in reducing crowding. So who was able and who is able to use active mobility instead of riding the public transportation has been supporting the use of public transportation for all those who otherwise would have had not a good alternative. And of course, it comes together with a complex mix of additional policies, because we need the policies to promote active mobility, but we also need the policies in the market in the labor market, like flexible working times, the permission to work from home whenever this is feasible, the organization of home deliveries, and so on. But all in all, we have re-emerged, and we are re-emerging from the COVID lockdown experiences with a much better understanding of the important role that a better distribution of modal shares in favor of active mobility can deliver to society and urban resilience at large. And together with this, now there is also an important movement that is looking at the so-called cities of proximity, a way of rethinking the urban space in such a manner that I'm not forced to travel several kilometers from my dwelling, from my house, to meet my basic needs in terms of services, in terms of goods, in terms of leisure. We have learned through this crisis that if you cannot move people, if you cannot allow people to move freely over long distances, as it happens when you are living in the south part of the city and your job is in the northern part, or when you have long commuting trips on a daily basis, you need to find a way for people to find what they need within a distance so that they can easily walk and cycle. So this idea of the city of proximity is certainly not super new. It has been in the making for a long time, but it has got now a new significance and a new sense of urgency. And it is also part of an important movement that will ultimately help delivering more livable cities, not only in the historical city centers, but also in the more peripheral areas. So it can be part of a renovation of the urban environment, the renewal of the urban environment. And finally, active mobility and climate change. What I'm showing here is a document from 2011, 10 years ago, where we conducted as a WHO a critical analysis of what were at the time the IPCC. IPCC stands for International Panel on Climate Change, is the group of scientists who come and advise member states on climate change. So they were, what we did, we looked at the different kind of mitigation strategies and options, and what kind of so-called health co-benefits these would have been able to deliver. And what we found at that time was that a scenario where we have land use changes and alternatives to private motorized transport, and basically we have a package of walkways, cycleways, bus and rapid transport, would be the kind of solution that would deliver the highest benefits, because it would not only reduce carbon emissions, by at that time we were estimated 25%, but it would at the same time reduce air pollution, physical activity, road traffic injuries, noise and social effects. So now bear with me, this was 10 years ago, okay? And today, we have new evidence. This has been published by colleagues in Oxford. Dr. Christian Brand has been leading this part of the research. And what he has done, he has been looking at different cities all around Europe, has been looking at the diary, so the description, travel diaries of thousands of people who have been participating in these scientific studies, looking at the real patterns of cycling within cities. And basically what he has found is that bicycles, cycling, more cycling and more active mobility has a very important quantitative effect on reducing carbon emissions. Here are a couple of shots, screenshots from some of the interviews that came out around that time. I'm making this, you have the correct scientific quote of this slide at the bottom of the slide itself, so you can read the full study. But I thought it is good for our audience today just to get a glimpse of how sensational this new evidence is. Cycling is 10 times more important than electric cars for reaching net zero emissions in cities. This is fantastic, and we really hope that when in a month and a half from now, member states will go to Glasgow for the COP26 conference on climate change, these numbers will somehow pop up and people will think that, yes, of course, we have to decarbonize transport, but we must also invest into active mobility. And this is a very serious business with a very serious outcome for the environment. And finally, another dimension that we have been looking over time has been one about job creation. Very often there has been the feeling that, well, what is there? You don't have really skilled jobs, high quality jobs related to cycling and walking. Can you really have it? But, you know, we had some interesting research that we did a few years ago where we developed some scenarios. Of course, these are scenarios and they are based on things like, oh, what if all the major cities had the same level of cycling as Copenhagen, which is pretty high. But you know, it is a pretty high, but exists. So we cannot say it doesn't exist. There are some cities that have a very high level of cycling. And what we saw there is that because cycling is a complex kind of behavior and activity, we have a very high potential of creating new jobs in relation, for example, to the running of bicycle rental schemes, all the logistics of it, the programming of it, the service that we can provide to the users, from gadgets, repairing shops, sales of bicycles. And you will not be surprised to know that during the lockdowns, several companies selling bicycles have had waiting lists of several months for the delivery of bicycles and to their customers. So there has been a boom in the industry that, again, we have to bear in mind because active mobility can make a very, very important contribution also to economic prosperity of cities. Also brings a very good business to the businesses in the areas where cycling and walking are facilitated. Simply because people love to spend more time in a high quality environment, and they are happy to also to spend their money or to make their shopping in places where you can also, you know, stop, have a drink and enjoy your urban life. But I will stop here, because there is so much more to say, and because it is a time for us to move from my motivational talk. Then I hope that you were motivated. You feel like now, the moment that we will be done with this lecture, we will go out and take a nice walk or ride a bike to the nearby park. And I will stop here, and I will give the floor now to my colleague Nick, a partner and a friend over the past 20 years. Nick, it is a great pleasure today to share this talk with you. The floor is yours. Before that, because unfortunately I will have to proceed to something else, and also because we are more or less at half of our time and presentation, I would like to stop here and give you a chance of asking your burning questions or making any comment or asking me anything about what I've just presented to you. You can use, I think, the chat in the chat function, or you can raise your hand with the reaction, and I'm sure that the colleagues will help me to monitor the reaction from all of you. I will stop sharing my screen also, because then Nick will be able to start sharing his. So happy to take any questions at this stage.
Дорогая Франческа, спасибо за ваш...
Dear Francesca, thank you very much indeed for your wonderful intro and motivational speech using the bicycles in our everyday life. While our colleagues are bereft of questions, if there will be any questions, we will definitely let you know. Once again, thank you very much for your fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Nick, the floor is yours then.
Thank you, Francesca. I will continue where you left off and move from that motivational and global view of the importance of cycling and walking and active mobility, and focus in on what should we do about it, or what have we done about it. So you've told us of the importance of active mobility for health and the environment, for urban mobility and for urban survival and resilience in the pandemic. And so, you know, our goal overall is to increase cycling and walking. And this was our goal 10 plus years ago when we thought about the heat. And we said to ourselves, how can we promote physical activity through the transport planning profession? How can we get urban professionals and planners on our side, and how can we get them to help us? So we said to ourselves, we need to make the health benefits of cycling and walking visible to transport and urban planners. Everyone knows walking is good for you. Everyone knows cycling is good for you. As you said, Francesca, you go to the doctor and they might say, you should walk more. This is general knowledge. And we wanted to quantify and substantiate and strengthen that understanding. Secondly, a really important aspect is speaking the language of the people you're trying to work with. Our good colleague, Professor Harry Rutter, talks about walking a mile in their shoes. So if we want to persuade transport and urban planners to work with us, we need to understand what makes them tick, what excites them, what drives them, what changes their decisions. So we had to think about how they make decisions. And which brings me to the third point, which is the high importance in many countries of economic analysis in transport planning. We began to see quite clearly that roads are not built and bridges are not built and transport decisions are not made if the economic case says that it's not worth it. You know, in order to justify a new road, most countries do an economic appraisal to show that the economic benefits are greater than the risks. And we were frustrated that health wasn't a part of that weighing up, that economic analysis. So we understood the importance of economic analysis. So those are the sort of beginning principles that we began with this thing that we're discussing today, the heat. So what is heat? Well, hopefully many of you have seen already and maybe even had a look at the online tool. There's the web address, heatwalkingcycling.org. And as I said, this was really quite specifically designed for transport planners to use as a practical tool. So this is not advertising or eulogizing or motivational talk. This is a practical tool to bring the motivational issues to life. It's about an economic assessment of the health benefits of walking or cycling. So we understand the health, we understand the environmental benefits. This is saying, how does that translate into economic benefits? It calculates the effects only, and I've put that in inverted commas, on mortality. I think we'll explain later why that's important. But mortality is not only obviously the strongest, most important measure, how much people's life can be extended by greater physical activity, fitness, and health. But we also have the strongest evidence for the impacts of physical activity on mortality. So we use that as the basis for building the tool. And I'll talk in a moment about the principles, but WHO in particular was very strong on saying they will only endorse any tool if it's strongly evidence-based. So we designed the HEAT, the Health Economic Assessment Tool, for all the member states of WHO Europe. And these include really civil servants, so people working for national or local or regional state governments, primarily for staff supporting policymakers. So while decision makers and politicians in municipalities and local authorities make the decisions, they usually need someone else to do the sums and do the calculations. So they were a primary target audience for us. We're interested in talking to officers and experts who in local areas were responsible for transport and urban planning. And we became very aware that there were very large differences in capacity. So that how many staff are available, how many people are available in each country to look at these types of things, their level of skill and understanding of data, and also the availability of data. And I know when you do some case study explorations with Thomas Gotchi later, I'm sure that will come up as an issue, the data that you have available, for example, on levels of walking and cycling in cities or areas that you're looking at. This is a big, busy slide, and really its only message is that a lot of consultation and collaboration has gone behind the development of the HEAT. So many collaborators, most are named there, with expertise across a lot of disciplines. And this has been particularly interesting for those of us involved in the HEAT, because we had to begin with epidemiology. We had to begin with understanding how much mortality is reduced by how much physical activity. And you'll see, as Francesco explained, that's at the heart of the tool. But we had to filter that through issues to do with transport planning, environmental science, air pollution, the specific expertise on traffic safety, climate change, and so on. And so lots of different people have been involved at commenting and inputting to the tool throughout over the years. And WHO has been extremely imaginative and creative in finding various funding sources to help the HEAT get off the ground and keep going. So let's just think about the core principles on which the HEAT is based and how it was designed. I've said already, scientifically robust. It needs to be that in order to be defensible and to give authority and confidence in the people who use it. But it also has to be that to be approved by WHO. And so that was an essential core principle. And in a way, in tension with that is usability. So sometimes the more scientifically robust and complex you make something, perhaps the less usable it might be. And so but throughout, we have been very aware that if we want this tool to be used by the broadest possible number and type of people, then it needs to be usable. It needs to be easy to understand and easy to use. And we thought that meant minimal data input. So we don't want people having to find numerous surveys and countless bits of data from all across the place in order to use the tool. Not too much data needed. Secondly, we have worked hard to provide default values. So if you don't know the proportion of walking or cycling in your city, or if you don't know how much an intervention might move people from cars to walking and cycling, then default values are available within the tool. And in all cases, we encourage people to use locally specific data, but default values are available. in line with any sort of website or tool, the tool comes up with prompts and questions to ask you to think about different points of the tool or different bits of data. And we've thought very carefully about their design and the flow of the tool and how easy it is to be used. And third core principle is transparency. So this is about always displaying the sources of data, always describing clearly the approach and the assumptions taken. Because the last thing we want is for people to say, well, I've got these results, but I don't know where they've come from. We want people to say, well, it's been based on this, with this assumption, and using assumptions where necessary. The next point is about such assumptions always being conservative. So with any calculation, there's usually a range of values provided. So we know that physical activity will reduce all-cause mortality by this much to this much. There's a range. We know that poor air pollution is linked to poor physical health, a range of values. When the tool is designed, we choose the most conservative of those values so as not to be accused of exaggerating the importance of physical activity. So to make sure that the tool is as reliable as possible. And then final two, we've tried to make it adaptable and modular. And over the years, we've changed the way that it's been presented and we've added on different modules to stick to that. Right, what does it do? So enough of the general, let's look quite specifically about what HEAT tries to do. So it answers this question. If a number of people walk or cycle a certain amount, Y, on most days, what is the economic value of the health benefits that occur as a result of the reduction in mortality due to their physical activity? So let's just unpick that a little bit. So that's a dense sentence. We've got a number of people walking or cycling more, and we know that they're walking or cycling an amount more. So we have to know the number of people and we have to know how much they're walking or cycling. The HEAT then calculates the health benefits that occurs as a result of that walking or cycling. It calculates that in terms of the reduction in mortality, so the reduced number of people who die in any 1 year as a result of that walking and cycling, compared to people who don't walk or cycle. So a walking and cycling population compared to a normal or sedentary population. And then when we know the health benefits and the reduction in mortality, we apply an economic value to that. And so answering that question gives people a value of this change in physical activity. And then over the years, people have said, oh, yes, that's all very well, valuing more cycling and walking, but you're assuming those people don't suffer any negative impacts as a result of walking or cycling in polluted air, or as a result of their increased risk of being injured or killed in a crash. So the new HEAT option adjusts the output for the increased risk of air pollution and crashes. And then finally, as Francesca very clearly explained at the beginning, we're always very interested in the environmental aspects of such tools. So where people are able to, or are looking at a shift from motorised transport to physical transport, walking and cycling, active transport, we can look at the effects on the emissions of carbon. So if we're successful in getting a number of people out of cars and onto bikes, we can look at the impacts on carbon as well as their overall health benefits. And there's plenty of time at the end for questions to clarify any of these more complex issues. So why would we want to do that? Or more specifically, where or in what situations can we use the HEAT? Three main areas, really. First of all, is assessing levels of walking or cycling. So it's almost like a static calculation. What's the value of walking or cycling now in my city, region, or country? How much is it worth? How much does it contribute? What economic value does it produce? Secondly, and perhaps the most common usage, is assessing changes. So before and after. So before we implemented a citywide building of the bicycle network, we had X cyclists, and after we had Y cyclists. What is the value of that change? Or scenarios, so comparing one scenario with another. You might be interested in comparing one town or city with another, or comparing a town or city with a fictional example or a hypothetical example. But we're able to look at those sorts of estimates. And often those changes or differences in walking and cycling are done as scenarios. So not real examples of change, but scenarios. What if we increase cycling by 10%? What if we had the same value, the same levels of cycling as Amsterdam? That's quite a popular one. So that's can be a very creative approach with bullet point 2. And the third one is evaluation of projects. And so if you have seen a change in cycling or walking as a result of a project, and you've measured the changes in cycling and walking, then you can put a value to the changes that have been seen as a result of those new or existing projects. And they can be the value of those health benefits or risks. So we've built a new cycle infrastructure. We've seen thousands of more new cyclists cycling an average of 5 kilometers per day, for example. What's the value of that? Then secondly, we can say, well, how much did we pay for that infrastructure, and produce a benefit to cost ratio? And that can be a very powerful, but also easy to understand number. The benefits outweigh the risks by 3 to 1 or €5 to 1 or whatever. So that I'm trying to make it sound simple. Perhaps it's beginning to sound complex, but let's just try to unpick a little bit what is actually needed to use the heat. Well, first of all, here's the good news. The data that you need to provide, the user, is relatively simple. It's really 2 main data items. The travel behavior, so how much cycling or walking is done, and the population that you're looking at. So who is doing that cycling or walking? And as I'm sure Thomas will go to in some detail later, that can be from local transport surveys, from very local transport surveys, in other words, trail side monitoring, for example. It could be done from interview surveys of cyclists or pedestrians. In some cases, it might even have to be assumptions or estimates. But you need to have some data on who is doing how much walking or cycling. And then, in general, the tool can do the rest. As I mentioned before, lots of default values provided by the tool. These are often modifiable. You can change them if you have better data. And the same with the local setting. Public data has been used to input into the tool, but in all cases, the user can override this and put in their own data where necessary. So we've had, since 2011, when the online tool was launched, so before then we had lots of sort of test modules. We've had 55,000 visitors going to the website, using it 85,000 times, and we've seen loads of applications across the world. It was designed for Europe, but it's been taken on in many other places. And many of these have been documented in some of the papers we've produced. But what I'm going to do in a moment is take you through some of the example case studies. I really do want to emphasize that we're trying to explore a complex and complicated issue and trying to make it as simple to use as possible. We like this saying, simplicity is a complexity resolved. And here's a little screenshot just from the start of the website that shows you how, as you walk through the tool, on the right-hand side, you get lots of little pop-ups that try to help the user through the experience. So just for the last bit of my talk, I'm hopefully going to bring this to life with some examples of applications. As I've said before, Thomas is going to go into the sort of technical and practical aspects of the tool, but I hope I'm showing to you how useful it could be. And I think these applications will show many of the very creative ways that people have used it so far that might make you think, oh, we could try that. So in Pärnu, in Estonia, this was one example of evaluating new cycle routes. So they built some new cycle paths, and they wanted to, they were proposing to build cycle paths, and they wanted to justify the building of these cycle paths by doing an economic analysis. So they made a conservative assumption of the number of cyclists who would use this path, and they assumed that half of those would be enticed onto the route as a result of its appeal and it being convenient. And they calculated an average annual benefit of 112,000 euros. And so they used this calculation with decision makers to secure the funding to build the paths and to create a proper circular cycle route, and fed into the development of a master plan. So here's an example of one where some creative but conservative calculations were done, and they were projections and assumptions in order to demonstrate in advance the value of investing in these bike routes. In Glasgow, in the Centre for Population Health, they wanted to do the first scenario I talked about, valuing existing levels of cycling. So there's been a lot of good work done in Glasgow, in Scotland, to encourage cycling, particularly through increased provision of good quality separated cycle infrastructure. And in the Centre for Population Health, they said, well, what's this worth to us in terms of health benefits? So they used travel to work data from the census, so very strong data. And they did annual cordon counts, so a cordon around the city, and then they counted people who crossed it on a bicycle. And they produced a mean annual benefit across the whole city of between 3.5 and 4.5 million euros per annum. We're not sure what this led to, in terms of direct impact, but this was given loads of media coverage and political interest at the time, and has helped overall to sort of strengthen the case for cycling. So this is an idea of just saying, what's it worth in my city? And look how big this value is. Let's do something about it. In Boston, the interesting thing about this one is this, in Boston, USA, they use the heat backwards. So the heat was used to value a decrease in walking. So the Boston Metropolitan Area Planning Council were proposing to cut public transport. And as everyone knows, every public transport journey begins and ends with a walk. And so the public health people said, well, cutting public transport would be bad for walking and would be bad for public health. Let's try to get that overturned. And they quite creatively used the negative value of walking. So they said, if we decrease walking by X, and they estimated how much the changes would decrease walking, that would lead to 9 to 14 additional deaths per year at very high values, 57 to 89 million euros per year. And I think this fed into the debate about cutting public transport in Boston. So that was an interesting kind of negative approach. So the heat looks quite fixed, but you can be quite creative about it. Here's another example of a projection one. So as part of a public health, a European Commission-funded project, in Modena, Italy, they valued estimated or projected increases in cycling as a result of building a new path. And in this case, the figures were, again, quite impressive, and they were used to help secure agreement for the funding for this new path. So to do this, you have to estimate how many people you're going to get cycling and how far they're going to cycle, and the heat does the rest. In Palma in Spain, again, this was a projection. So this is potential increases in regular walking. Using a baseline mobility survey, they said, well, what if we increased walking by this much, and this much? And they produced annual benefits of 32.1 million, which were fed back to policymakers to encourage them to keep on working to promote walking, not cycling, walking in Palma. Just a few more examples. In Kuopio in Finland, this was specifically focused on city employees, so people who worked for the municipality in Kuopio, and they wanted to encourage cycling, especially during winter. So in Finland, they have pretty high levels of cycling, but quite understandably, because of the snow and ice, cycling levels drop off. And so in the city employees, they wanted to say, if we kept all of our existing commuter cyclists cycling all year, if we're able to provide facilities and conditions for them, it would produce an annual benefit, very high variable here, but between 396,000 and 7.6 million euros per year. And so as a result of that, the city council continued to promote cycling and tried to encourage it, particularly in the winter. And then final example is something I worked on with the Department for Transport in the United Kingdom, where, as with many, as I said right at the very beginning, most transport decisions involve an economic analysis. And in this case, they were looking at these things called cycling demonstration towns, which were towns where almost everything was done to promote cycling. And the experiment was, what would happen if we improve the infrastructure, did promotion and marketing, had a campaign to promote cycling, made it safer, slowed traffic, all at the same time. So did everything we can across the city. And there was an increase in cycling, and we were asked to use the Department for Transport's official tool called WebTag to look at all the benefits or costs of increasing that cycling. And you can see that there were some, quite significant benefits from things like decongestion, reduced absenteeism, because people are coming to work more often because they're able to get into work and they're healthier, and so on. But by far the biggest benefit came from the reduced mortality as a result of increased cycling. And so overall, there was seen to be a benefit to cost ratio of about 3, between 2.6 and 3.5. So it was every £1 spent resulted in 2 to 3 pounds of benefit. But here's the thing, physical activity accounted for 70% of that. And this really brings us right back to the beginning. If we hadn't used the heat, if we hadn't looked at this part, reduced mortality, then this sum would be much, much different, because for years, transport planners haven't properly assessed the economic and social and environmental and health benefits of walking and cycling. And the heat helps us to fight back and to make the difference. So my part is coming to an end, but I just want to outline really that the heat has been based on strong scientific evidence and a good instinctive, heartfelt rationale. It's been taken up well and applied well with good feedback. As I think the case studies show, we've used it well for advocacy and making the case for cycling and walking. And we have some evidence of where those decisions have fed into policy. But we still see, if we're honest about the challenges, we find challenges in finding the data. And I'm sure that you will encounter that later when you do some case studies. People find challenges in interpreting the findings. What does this really mean? And of course, people have problems, even with strong evidence and strong data. If you give that to a policymaker who is pro-car and anti-bike and doesn't want to see these changes through, it probably won't make the difference. So that remains a challenge that perhaps the heat can't solve. And overall, we need more applications, more examples. So we would be absolutely delighted if after this workshop and this training, and after Thomas's work later exploring examples with you, if you were able to try some examples and send them in to us, we'd be delighted to use those in future occasions. I'll remind you of the URL, which I'm sure you're familiar with because you've probably been looking at it already, to outline that there are a number of user guides available that really bring to life this idea of transparency, showing where all the values come from. And I thought I'd just end with this idea that lots of creative thinking can come when we're riding our bicycle. Thank you. Now, I have a little quiz to check if people have been listening and to underline the main findings of the main aspects of the tool. Shall I pause for questions now, if there are general questions, and then go through the quiz questions, which are just a light-hearted way to get people thinking and see if they remembered? Shall I pause for questions now?
Nick, спасибо.
Nick, thank you very much indeed for your presentation of your program. Could you please tell us, in order for the heat to work, where do we get the data for the input? You mentioned that one of the tools would be the poll among the citizens. What other tools outside the polls could be used to gather data?
Thank you. That's a really good question. So this will be gone into in great detail with Thomas later on today, where he will be looking at specific examples of how to find data and how to apply it to the tool. But I'll answer for now. As I emphasize, we need to find out how many people are doing how much walking or cycling. And so one very reliable way to find that is from a survey. So if you have a transport or travel survey or a traffic survey, or maybe a health and physical activity survey that, along with questions on nutrition and smoking, say, asks people about exercise, those can all be used if they quantify the amount of walking or cycling. So with a transport survey, you'll usually be talking about the number of journeys that are walked or cycled compared to driven. With a physical activity survey, you'd be talking perhaps about the amount of time spent in walking or cycling in a week. Those can all be used, and the HEAT has sort of tried to understand that type of data and allows that type of information to be put in. You can even input pedometer data. So if you had a study where people use a pedometer or even the steps from a mobile phone, that can be an input value. So those are surveys. Secondly, you might conduct, and this is quite common with bike paths, you might conduct monitoring, so trail side monitoring. So this is someone sitting at the side of a path, usually with a clicker, counting the number of people who go past. Now, the advantage of that is that it's a very accurate measure. You know exactly the number of cyclists going past that trail. The disadvantage is that you don't know how far they've gone or for how long they've cycled. And so another method is often a trail side survey. So you stop a cyclist and say, do you mind answering some questions? And you ask them about their travel patterns. And then, so those are the main ways, so surveys and monitoring. But in addition, don't forget that a lot of the applications I talked about are hypothetical or scenarios. And so for those types of estimates, you don't actually need a measure. You need perhaps a realistic projection. And so as an example, we could say, what if the population of Moscow increased its cycling by 10 minutes per week, or current people who currently cycle in Moscow increase their cycling by 10 minutes a week. So to do that, we just need the existing levels of cycling. So those are the main ways. Francesca, have I covered them mainly, do you think?
Yes, Nick. I coming from, as you can guess from my accent, I'm Italian. And Italy is one of the countries that do not have a national cycling survey. contrary to some other countries that have national travel surveys, like in the UK, which is a very rich one. But in Italy, we have the so-called census. It is a statistical survey that is implemented every 10 years across the general population, and it covers many different aspects of the life of Italians, from one of which is also you have to report on how you commute to work or you go to bicycle. And for many Italian experts who are grappling with these numbers, looking at the data of the census is at least a proxy, a way to approximate and to know, okay, in this city, in this region of Italy, or at the national level, we know that it is 5% of the population who is cycling or walking or using a public transportation. Unfortunately, because cycling, there is an elephant in the room. Cycling and very often walking have not been considered serious modes of transport by many countries until very recently. There are so many countries where bicycles are considered a toy or are considered a sport equipment. So you may know how many professional or amateur cyclists are there, but you might have no clue of how many people go to work or for leisure reasons use a bike. And this has to do with the fundamental problem that we have with the transport statistics that have always, for a number of reasons, focused on motorized transport. So in most countries, you know how many kilometers were driven by a specific model of car, but you are unable to say how many people are riding a bicycle. From commercial companies, you can buy or you can get access to data that are available to the industry. For example, you may easily know how many bicycles have been sold in a certain country, in a certain cities, in a certain district, because at the level of industrial association, this information normally is available and it is published. But the problem, of course, is that knowledge about the number of bicycles that exist and are sold tells us nothing about whether these bicycles are on the roads or are, getting covered with dust and the web cobs in a cellar. So, but there are some other data that perhaps one can use, and it is a matter of being, in a way, trying to become more assertive in collecting the good data. So I would say in all the cities that are contemplating to make a serious move to cycling and walking, my advice would be go and develop and make the initial investment into developing your understanding of how much people are cycling and how much people are walking. And there are very good ways of doing that. We are happy to support and to provide you with some, for example, good surveys which have been implemented elsewhere. We can facilitate that. If there is not such a capacity or such an appetite, then one needs to become somewhat creative. It is by looking at cities that are similar in size and in, let's say, meteorological situations to your city. And then you can say, okay, if such a city in Finland, and I'm speaking of Finland because it is a country where there is a good level of cycling, where, for example, we have worked with the colleagues there, right, Nick, and we know they were measuring these. And it has some similarities, like you have long winters, cold weather, that you can say, okay, this may relate to some situations in my own city. You can also say, okay, let's assume that we are comparable to such another city. Or you need to do some triangulation where you try to get your size by looking, okay, this has been the trend in the sales of bicycles. This has been a quick, count that we have seen on the streets. So it's there is not a unique answer. But the good thing, as Nick has said, is that very often you may wish to use the heat to make these what-if scenarios so that you are able to participate in a policy dialogue. But wait a second, what if we had 10% more of cyclists or 10% more of pedestrians using this thing? How things could change? What would this mean? So I'm sorry, it was a little bit of a longer answer, but we do know that for all the simplicity of the heat, we are very, very proud. You know, this is the one thing I'm super proud of. And when we work with the experts, I always say, don't touch this, please. Because I say this is the only tool that the people can use using only two input numbers: the number of people affected and the amount of cycling and walking. But for this simplicity, I also acknowledge that this is the first important stumbling block for many users. So they come and they say, but wait a second. How many? What is this number? What does it mean? Where do I find it? Exactly what you were asking, Irina. So many thanks for the question, and I hope that this will increase your appetite in your cities and networks and regions to have a good, solid investment into collecting the basic data. This is something that we have learned. If you don't measure, you don't see. And you cannot argue. You cannot even say if an investment was wrong or if a piece of infrastructure was really good, because you have no way to tell it. And you have also then later on no way of making a correction, a sensible correction, because basically you have been developing something a bit, shooting in the high. Over.
Francesca, Nick, спасибо вам за такой...
Francesca and Nick, thank you very much indeed for your augmented answer. Nick, I have a question for you. You gave us an example, Boston, Glasgow, and Pärnu, that calculation were made for those. I would like to make sure these results, were any applications for the results? If these cities, if they ever used these numbers you provided, and if they did use your numbers, how did they use them?
That's a really good question, and I'm afraid to say we often don't really know the answer to those questions. We are always searching for direct applications. We would love to find examples where the heat was used to solve a problem, and everyone says that the heat was the thing that made the difference. And if I'm honest, we don't usually find that. We usually find that the heat is part of a discourse, part of a conversation, one part of the evidence that's used to make transport planning decisions. And it's really difficult to unpick those specific examples. In a few cases that I presented, we've been told, yes, it was the economic calculation that made the difference. But we see it more as one tool in the toolbox, or one thing that you can draw upon to make the case.
If I may chip in on this, Nick, this is
Спасибо, Ник. У нас в Москве активно развивается велосипедное движение.
Thank you, Nick. In Moscow, bicycling actively being developed. Year after year, you could see more and more bicycle riders on our roads. A lot of people prefer to spend times in parks. There are a lot of parks in Moscow, the green areas in Moscow that are very comfortable. People can spend time there. And right now, they attract a lot of people. Together with Tom, we will do our best to do the homework, to do the due diligence all over Moscow, to gather the data, get the data. That would be very interesting. And I also think that for participants of this here workshop from far removed regions, it would be really interesting in real time to do this kind of work and get the results from some specific examples of some specific cities or towns. I do hope that our colleagues would get your idea, would jump on this trend and would use your idea to do the evaluation and assessment within their towns and cities, and they will be able to improve their city infrastructure, and that would also give additional results for better city planning.
Yes, may I respond? That sounds really hopeful. I very much hope you are able to achieve that. And in terms of the levels of cycling in Moscow, if you've seen the levels go up, and if you have data to measure those, then a creative thing would be some scenarios. So you can say, what is the value of increasing at the same rate, but also what's the value of accelerating that increase? Or even, what would be the value if we achieve... And I've often liked these scenarios in terms of a communication. What would be the value if we achieve the same level of cycling as in Latvia? What would be the same value if we achieve the same level of cycling as in Copenhagen, where it's extremely high? And that gives you a range then, and that communicates to policymakers and brings it to life. And they say, well, what can we do to be like Copenhagen if we need to achieve these values? So, I'm encouraged that you've seen increases in cycling, and would encourage you to, as Francesca said, collect the data on that and use that data to keep making the case.
Да, мы с Томасом...
Yes, we will be working with Thomas, and we'll be using our data, and we'll try to recalculate the results about Moscow. It is really interesting to us, reason being that bike rentals and bicycling gathers more and more popularity in Moscow, and I do hope that it will continue developing.
Ника, вы еще также говорили, что хотите...
Nick, you also mentioned that you have intention to do the little bit of a quiz from what...
Мы можем это сделать сейчас.
We can do it now, in real time, or we can do it by way of forwarding the questions from you to our participants.
Let's do it now and just see if people answer in the chat.
Хорошо.
It's 4 easy, lightweight questions. So the first one is, what does HEAT stand for? You notice I've blocked it out in the top left. Oops, that's the answer. So for the next one, in the chat, just quickly write down your answer. So B. So what modes of transport does HEAT cover? Is it just cycling? Is it just walking? Or is it cycling and walking? This time I'll wait until I see a few letters in the chat. There's a couple of votes come in already. Okay, 100% response, correct response so far. Cycling and walking. We began considering only cycling nearly 20 years ago, and then soon added walking because it's clearly a much more universal, but also extremely important mode of transport.
Can I come in on this one? I want to share with all of you a small secret. The greatest incentive to go for walking was given by a colleague from the Russian Federation.
Oh.
Dr. Vadim Donchenko is, at that time, he was the scientific director of NIAT, and we were working together, and he told me one day during a meeting, Francesca, yes, this is very interesting, but if you really want to do something useful, you have to think of the countries where cycling is not so prevalent. I think you should really go for walking. And that was a very, very important incentive, I must say, for us to develop that. So thanks again, Russian Federation, for pushing us into the walking module of the HEAT. So I'm sharing with you little pieces of the history, of the backstage history of this tool and our work with the Russian experts, in fact. Thank you.
Fantastic story. Third question, there are only 4. What calculations does HEAT provide? So do you remember, is it the economic assessment of the value of decreased mortality? Does it estimate the likely uptake of cycling and walking programs? Or does it estimate the savings to the health system due to reduced injuries? So A, B, or C? And number 3. Tap it into the chat, A, B, C. Oh, this is harder. No one's voting. 1 vote so far. Oh, no, 2. Three votes in. Three people have been listening. Yeah. And 3 people are correct. 4 people are correct. It's about the decreased mortality from walking and cycling, which is then converted into money, an economic assessment. Final question. Which of the following impacts does HEAT calculate? Is it physical activity, air pollution, the risk of crashing on the road, or all of these? One vote. Now, I can't say this quiz is too easy. So everyone who's voted so far has got everything right. So either the quiz is too easy or the confident people are the ones who vote. But either way. So most people have said D. It is all of these. Do you remember? It's the impact. The primary impact is on physical activity, so increases in walking and cycling and the benefits to health. But we adjust these for the disbenefit, the negative benefit of air pollution and the risk of crashing. So it does. So it looks at all of those impacts. So that's the end of the quiz. That was just a little bit of a reminder. To get people thinking about the key messages. So thank you.
Ник, спасибо вам большое за такой...
Nick, thank you very much indeed for that short quiz to test our knowledge. That was a little bit unexpected by our viewers, and I am very happy that every participant was really paying attention and got the answers right. And I hope that their knowledge will be useful to them when they're continuing with their careers. In the meantime, we have no more questions from our colleagues. If there will be any questions, perhaps we'll be able to forward them by way of email, if it is possible, or we may also forward them to the chat if you will remain here. And Francesca, further down the road today with our workshop.
Okay, thank you very much.
Спасибо, Ник, спасибо.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Francesca. We do hope that we shall continue working together and with you and with World Health Organization.
Thanks to you for hosting us today. I am just missing terribly seeing everybody in person, and I am missing the interaction of being there together. I hope that next time we will be able to ride through Moscow and to have perhaps a living class, a master class on the wheels. That would be fantastic, exciting. And we hope that you will continue to enjoy the masterclass, the next module with Thomas, that will take you much more in depth into the tool. And I share with you another little piece of information and of the history of this tool about how has it been used. Well, I would say one good use was in Austria. That was where they used the HEAT tool to make a calculation of what it would be achieving the targets, the objectives of what at the time was the National Cycling Master Plan. So they made some scenarios. They used the HIT tool to calculate the impact. And they used that as a very powerful tool to advocate the adoption by the government of the first cycling master plan of Austria. So we were very proud that a tool like this could help a government to push forward, an important element in their transport and environmental policy agenda. So I leave you with this sign of hope and also sign of relevance of the work that we can do together. We can make changes, we can support the changes, and we can, make our cities better places to be healthy and to be happy. Because very often, being healthy is a more difficult concept than saying being happier in the places where we live. And we believe that this is more easily understandable and it is more comprehensive. And it also is very much in line with the definition of the WHO, the health definition of the WHO in our beautiful constitution of 1948 is health is not just the absence of disease. It is much more than that. It is a sense of well-being and that we are able to fulfill who we are in the environments in which we live. So I leave you with this thought. It's not mine, it's of the great visionary people who came together to provide this still today very inspiring definition of health. And I hope that this will stay with you as you continue in this throughout these master classes. Have a lovely afternoon. And thanks, Nick, for being the great partner always for me when we are, participating and doing these exercises together. Bye-bye.